Scotty is the Millennium Health Rep in our region. He's a wonderful resource, and here's Scotty, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Mark. First, I'd like to thank Mark Montel for inviting us to be here today. Hopefully we can be helpful for you guys in your practices. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Kelly Olson. If you have any questions about Millennium Health or about drug testing after it's done, we of course have a booth. Savannah Scottson and I will be sitting out here at the booth. If you guys have any questions, we can certainly get you more information or come visit you in your practice. So, like I said, I'm excited to introduce Kelly Olson. She's a PhD coming to help us out today. She's going to speak about the clinical value of urine drug testing and pain management. Kelly has an exciting, interesting, and varied background. She's currently, Dr. Olson is the Associate Director of Clinical Affairs at Millennium Health. She's an experienced researcher in molecular neuropharmacology as well as in clinical biology in the areas of mental illness, sleep, adrenal fatigue, and addictions. Dr. Olson has authored and co-authored a number of peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and presentations, and has lectured extensively internationally, nationally, and has been, now this is her second time, I think, to Montana. So thank you very much for coming up, Doc. She's also spent the majority of the past 7 years in integrative medicine, helping improve clinical outcomes. She received her Master's of Science degree from the University of North Dakota. Let's not hold that against her. And a PhD in pharmacology and therapeutics from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Kelly Olson.
Thank you.
One more thing real quick, there's slide decks out there on your tables, and then there's a little evaluation form too. If you guys could fill it out and leave it on the table, that'd be great.
All right, thank you. Oh, it does work. It wasn't working for a while, and I thought I'd have to really yell. As Scotty mentioned, this is my second time to Montana. So I was in Great Falls, Montana initially, and now this is my first visit to Missoula, so second time. And I actually have family that owned a business in Hungry Horse. So I do have some affiliation with Montana. And I found out as well that Montana has some really interesting facts about it. It's the home of Evel Knievel, which I think that's really cool. I'm originally from Canada, so I know cold, and apparently you all do as well. There's somewhere here that it got to be minus 70. And so I've experienced minus 50 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but I've never experienced minus 70, so that was another fact. And then you have these beautiful gemstones called Yogo sapphires, which again, that's appealing to a lady who loves gems. So that's really cool as well. So I'm really excited to be here, especially at this conference. As Scotty mentioned, I do have about 8 years of integrative medicine, going on 9 now, where I've worked a lot with sort of the addiction side or mental health side of things. And pain has been something that we know go hand in hand. Sometimes we don't even know which one comes, first often. And so I'm very honored to be here in front of you all to tell you about the science and sort of some of the clinical behind urine drug testing. But hopefully we can also get a little bit further into what it is that you all do, the challenges that you face, etc. So we'll try to kind of bridge the gap between the scientist that's standing in front of you right now and you all, the clinician. So we'll get moving as fast as we can through some slides, and then other slides I'll spend more time. But just as a disclaimer, I am a scientist through and through. So even though I keep talking about waving the corporate flag, you will hear the science as it's current today. And anything you want to know about the business side of things, if you want, we can address it at the end. So we try to keep church and state fairly separate. So if that's all right with you, we'll get moving here. So these are the objectives that the presentation contains. I really want to hammer the point. Mark had mentioned this a little bit as well with liquid chromatography. We call that confirmatory testing. I'd really like to spend a bit of time in understanding sort of those dip tests or those instant read cups versus something like confirmatory testing. So that's one of the objectives. I want to show you not only how that type of testing can help, but the differences between the two modalities, because sometimes there are some existing fallacies out there that I want to dispel. And then secondly as well, I want to do this with regards to a couple case studies. Because oftentimes we talk about the theory, and as a scientist, I'm really good at that, to the point where it can be like chewing on sawdust, and that's no fun. What really counts is putting the rubber to the road and using that science to help your patients and clients. So those are the objectives for today's talk. So this is a quote that, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Dr. Steve Pasek? A number of you are. He is an absolute guru when it comes to clinical psychology, particularly in pain medicine and management. And I put this quote up by him, and I think it would really behoove us to go through it. Humanity is not demonstrated by the willingness to provide opioids, nor is it shown by being overzealous about protecting people from opioids. Humanity is demonstrated by maximizing what can be done to help, while minimizing harm to those who suffer. We owe it to the suffering people who seek our help for pain to be thoughtful, careful, educated, and open-minded. If we are all of these things, our humanity will be obvious. And I really thought that was a poignant quote, given the fact that all we hear is opioid epidemic, or clinics being shut down for over-testing or under-testing, or giving out too many prescriptions for opioids. I was sitting at a pain conference in Washington, D.C. last year, and on the stage were two expert physicians. One was Lynn Webster, if you've ever heard of him, and another person sitting beside them was an actual pain patient. And the really interesting piece to this is we're always used to hearing the medical side, or the sort of the clinician side of pain management. But they opened it up and they had this lady tell her story. And she had no affiliation with the clinic at all, but she spoke about how she couldn't be up on that stage if it weren't for opioids, and properly prescribed and monitored opioid therapy. And I thought that really spoke to me as well, that we were able to meld the two sides of the coin, if you will, and how important it is to be able to not only prescribe, but monitor these medications. What we're finding, and I'll sprinkle in a few stories as we go, but what we're finding is things like oxycodone, certain opioids that are out there can be used nefariously. And I'll show you that as we move through the slide deck. There's a lot of things that I want to dispel with regards to where people are even getting their opioids. So we'll start with that as well. This is a slide I won't go through too in depth. It really speaks to the prevalence of pain, but you all know that. You're in the trenches, you see this all the time. It's still pretty amazing when you actually see numbers. Again, chronic pain affecting 100 million Americans. And if you look down below, more prevalent than the incidence of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes combined. So what you all do, not to remind you, because you know how frustrating it can be, it's one of the top treatment, or I guess disciplines, if you will, pain medicine, that we know today. Well, we're talking about some pretty big disease states here. So let's move forward. So under treatment of chronic pain. So we talk about, and even President Obama speaks of this, that opioid epidemic. So we all know what it means to overprescribe. But what about underprescribing? One could argue that's an equally problematic issue, the underprescribing. And why is it that now we're sort of swinging more toward the underprescribing? Well, there's a number of potentials listed there: limited knowledge and skills, perceptions regarding chronic pain and opioids, etc., and fear of substance abuse or addiction. Last night, one of my friends texted me and said, "What are you doing in Montana?" And I said proudly that I'm coming to engage and talk with you all about opioids and pain management, etc. And he said, "Oh, by the way, maybe you should know this about me, but I was addicted to opioids." And I thought, well, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea. This is a friend of mine for some time. Here he had smashed his elbow as a kid. And so he started as a 10-year-old on pain medications. Of course, he got off them. Fast forward a number of years, in his 30s, he had a cough, and he was prescribed a medicine that had an opioid in it, very, very mild. But that started to walk him down that path again. And he said, I remember the first time when I was 10, and I felt that euphoria. And I felt it again at 30. And he said, I've now struggled with it for 10 solid years. So again, this is something that kind of information is really important on the overprescribing side of things. But let's focus on the underprescribing as well. And so that's why I put this slide in. We hear too many stories like the one I've just talked about. But we also got to talk about the folks that are on stage because of proper opioid therapy. So we can't lose that. So this is illicit drug use for 2014, and this is from SAMHSA. So it's a substance abuse group that puts this out every year. One thing I just want to highlight, and I hope I've got my highlighter here, this is in the millions. So this is from age 12 and older, which was a bit disconcerting when you think about the fact that these are 12-year-olds we're talking about. Any illicit drug within the last month, so this is not even annually, this is within the last month, 27 million folks admitted to that, any illicit drug. And the top drug that was used was marijuana. But if you look at psychotherapeutics, that includes things like sedatives, tranquilizers, pain medications. It's sitting at about 6.5 million in terms of the respondents. So again, in the last month, this is a fairly serious statistic. And I wanted to make sure that you've seen this, because this does not necessarily cover populations throughout the world. This is just in our country with a smaller cohort, if you will. But we're talking millions of people are on these particular prescriptions and non-prescriptions. So they're getting it from somewhere else. And if you look up here, heroin, inhalants, hallucinogens, and cocaine, don't even touch that. Don't even come close. And how many of you know that heroin is absolutely on the rise? It's so cheap, it's so pure, and it's so available. We had a 13-year-old, she looked like a 13-year-old, she might have been older, might have been younger, in a park in Portland, Oregon, not that long ago, sitting off to the side of a bench, shooting heroin up between her toes. In public, in the sunshine. We definitely have an issue with that. This is something that I really am excited to show you. This is important because many of us here, or perhaps anecdotally know, that a lot of patients and clients do doctor shopping. So they'll jump across state lines, they'll do whatever they can to potentially get another prescription from another doctor. Well, a study was done on where these opioids are coming from. And you can see here on the far, this blue side on the right-hand side, that about 53% were coming free from a friend or a relative. 53% of what was studied. And so that means that maybe, let's say, in grandma's purse or auntie's purse or something, there's some kind of an opioid, and grandson or somebody else is coming in and either taking it without them knowing, or they're being given freely. So it's not doctor shopping necessarily. This is coming from a family member. And if you look here, you can see in this green side, bought or took from a friend or relative. So the mass majority of where folks are getting non-prescribed opioids is a friend or a family member. And if you look at the top here, more than one doctor sits at about almost 3%. That was astounding to me, because I had always heard the same thing, that there was a lot of doctor shopping going on. We had a case as well where someone showed positive for Xanax in a urine drug test and not prescribed. Well, here her friend knew that she had some anxious issues, so she said, hey, why don't you just take one of my Xanax? No big deal. Until a drug test was taken. And then it became a very big deal. So clinical guidelines. With all of this information, it's also really important to have these guidelines with which we can follow. Again, they're helpful for us to be in compliance with what is required of testing, et cetera. And we know that a lot of these overlap. American Pain Society, American Academy of Pain Medicine, all of those particular groups have guidelines that we can use to follow, and they're incredibly valuable. But we'll see things like risk-benefit assessments, where you're putting people in those risk stratification categories, goals and treatment expectations, consent, et cetera, ongoing monitoring. A lot of times they overlap. And we've got a great resource, by the way, that I really want to highlight. It's, have you heard of Gourlay and Height? They're two pain MDs. They've put out a urine drug test monograph, and I would highly recommend getting it. You can also get CEs from it as well. But that particular resource is amazing with showing you how these guidelines work together. So I think that might be something that may potentially assist you. This is also something really interesting as well. We know that when we're monitoring and measuring patient or treatment efficacy, this wheel is pretty important to keep us on track. Things like treatment efficacy and tolerability, that's pretty obvious with our patients. Functional goals, quality of life, again, something really important to measure how well we're doing. Aberrant behaviors and risk, the 4 A's, of course, is part of this. And then, of course, UDT, pill counts, et cetera. So UDT is urine drug testing. Now, how many of you have heard, and I don't know how prevalent this is in Montana, but how many of you have heard of pills being rented? So, okay, good. I'm glad you've heard that. A lot of people haven't. But what happens is, if I'm a patient and I come into your clinic and we're doing a pill count, if I know that I'm taking a certain pill, BID, per month, so I have a month prescription, and it's June 15th, I better have, how many pills left? Exactly, yep. So I better have that amount of pills left. And I know I don't because I'm selling my Oxy on the street. So I'm getting a heck of a lot more for that, and it's kind of feeding into my heroin addiction. So if I come to you and you're doing a pill count, I'm going to go down the street, I'm going to rent the proper number of oxycodone pills, and then I'm going to come into the clinic. So watch that. Don't only rely on one method of monitoring. And so again, that's where urine drug testing can certainly come into play, because it's an objective measurement of whether or not your patient is taking their prescriptions appropriately. And we'll get into that a little more as we go. So I'm glad that you all knew about that. So let's talk about urine drug testing. How many of you do urine drug testing already? Okay, good. How many of you do in-office collections where you've got the instant read? A few of you do? Okay, most of you are sending out for confirmation then. So we'll talk about sort of delineating the two modalities, as I mentioned before, but let's just talk about the reasoning why we do this type of testing. Not only do the guidelines recommend it, but also, as I mentioned before, it is really the only tool that gives us objective information about whether or not our patient or client is taking their medications. So I used to work in law enforcement. I was a border patrol or border guard for 7 years. And my very first day on the job, I had an old mentor who was so crotchety, I did not want to work with him, but I knew I'd learn. And so I remember this older gentleman, probably around 70 years old, came through with a nice pickup truck and a boat. And my mentor was standing right beside me, and I asked the prerequisite questions, and I asked a few others, and he seemed to satisfy my questions. And so I was about ready to let him go down the road. There was nothing that I felt was a kind of askew. Everything seemed to be on track. And my mentor said to me, "Kelly, pull him over." What that meant was pull him over to verify his declaration. And I said, "No, he answered all my questions. I'm not going to pull him over." So we went, I asked a couple more questions, same thing, "Kelly, pull him over." Finally, I said, "You know what? I'm going to get you to pull over to the left, and we're going to verify your declaration." And he got a little bristled with me, but I didn't really pay attention to that. So I went and I looked in the pickup truck, and in the back seat, and you're allowed 1 liter of alcohol and 1.24 of beer, just in case you want to know, to come into Canada. He had 2 1.75 liters of whiskey. He neglected to tell me. He had his whole entire boat full of building supplies. Again, neglected to tell me. And within those building supplies were 3 or 4 jerry cans full of gas. Now, this may on the surface not sound like much, but it completely blew his allotment. And the worst part is he looked me in the eye and he lied to me. And I had a really hard time with that. Again, my first day on the job totally jaded me for a while. But my point in telling you this story is not because I love that story and I just want to tell you. The point of me telling you this story is people will not necessarily tell you the truth, and it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the addiction and the desire to get what they want. So these objective measurements and tests that we have available to us nullify all of that. And so if you're concerned that potentially you may have some issues on your hands, something like an objective test like this opens that dialogue. Now, please hear me. This is not something for a gotcha moment. That's that more forensic side of testing that we'll talk about quickly. This is simply to open up dialogue, to get the truth, and to be able to help your patients much more effectively than you could have before. So let's keep moving here. So when we talked about this forensic model of urine drug testing in the clinical model, so how many of you remember, I guess it was really, we saw it mostly with the Vietnam War. Now, there were some things before that as well. The Vietnam War, many of the soldiers, unfortunately, were hooked on heroin. And so this forensic model really was to decide whether or not a soldier could come home. And so if they popped positive for heroin, they had to stay and they could not come home until they were clean. So that was that gotcha moment. Now, changing that to more of the clinical model, it's more for testing whether or not your patient is following treatment regimens, whether or not they're following their prescriptions appropriately, and if they have issues with illicits. Because as I mentioned before with oxycodone, a lot of folks are selling it on the street and getting a pretty penny and then supplementing with heroin because it's so much cheaper. There are other combinations as well, but essentially that's what we're looking at. It started off more workplace drug testing. A lot of pilots, bus drivers, et cetera, have to go through that type of testing. And what we do with the clinical side of urine drug testing is monitoring prescribed medications and or substance abuse. So there is a big difference here. So I wanted to make sure that y'all knew the difference between the two types of testing. Now, not only that, but the modalities. So remember at the beginning I talked about there being 2 modalities. One is more of that immediate screen, if you will, and the other one is sending it in for confirmation. Now, one thing to remember is that even those immediate screens, some folks, when they're positive, will send it in for confirmation. So that's kind of how the process goes. So the difference here is quite evident. If you look on the left side of your screen, minutes or days in that preemptive or presumptive, immunoassay screen, really, you can get an answer. It's just a color change or a line that shows up, and it's pretty instant. Another thing that really kind of defines that left side are drug classes. Some of them detect specific substances, but for the most part, it means benzo, or it means opioid, or something. But you don't necessarily have the specifics. Guidance for preliminary treatment decisions. I hear this all the time. I use my instant reads for guidance. And then at the bottom, this is where we start to see some of the difficulties. Higher cutoff levels and cross-reactivity common, more false positives and false negatives. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So there are some major gaps in that type of information, meaning that things like someone could be on Prilosec, for example, and it could be positive for THC. That's not a good thing. So if someone is taking it simply for acid reflux and they're popping positive for THC, probably not something they're going to be happy with. Now, if we look on the right-hand side, the definitive side, are laboratory quantitative, basically. So that's the LC-MS, MS, as Mark had mentioned, liquid chromatography, Hours to days, usually the turnaround time is a day to 2 days, and you have the results. Specific medications, substances, and metabolites. And here's the really interesting piece to this as well. Not only can you get specific as to which benzo they're on or which opioid they're on, but now we can test for illicit substances as well, like spice. How many of you have heard of spice? Good. That you can't test on those instant reads, but you can test that in confirmation. The other thing is as well is there's lower cutoff levels, false positives and negatives. The results are very rare. Very rarely will you get a false positive or negative. False positives and negatives, let's just talk quickly about that. On the left-hand side, false negative means the test fails to detect the presence of the drug or metabolites. With those instant read cups, let's say the cutoff is 500 for something, and I've got 400 as a level in my specimen, you will miss it. So it will show up as a negative even though it's in my body. False positive, the test incorrectly detects the presence of the drug when none is present. Very similar to the Prilosec THC example I gave. That's something as well in your handouts that you have. This is, again, this is not confirmation. You will not see this for confirmation. This is for instant read cups. There's some really interesting pieces here about certain drugs and then what they cross-react to show up like. And you'd be really surprised when you have time, have a look in your packets, and we can get you large size as well, so you can have it. Just don't have it in front where your patients can see it, because you know they'll use that. So just watch that. So we don't have a lot of time. Mark, I know things are, we got to sort of move along. In fact, 2 minutes, so that really doesn't give me much time at all. I shouldn't have talked about Canada and Montana and stuff. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the specifics, but this I think really is worth talking about. This is a head-to-head with an immunoassay, or those instant read cups, and confirmation. And I want to just show you a couple things in that red box. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see a drug here, opioids, tramadol, THC, etc. This red box is how often those instant reads missed detecting a particular molecule when it was in fact in the sample. And so if we look here, it missed tramadol about almost 5% of the time. But look at here with THC, it missed it about 41% of the time. So be really mindful in choosing which modality that you're going to use when you know about some of the issues with those particular, especially with the immunoassay. Now, I'm not standing up here to tell you that it's wrong and don't use it. That is not my decision. But be well educated about the modalities and know what you're getting when you get the results. So this, again, these are just some more statistics about the different types of testing. These are obviously what we, at the top it says Millenniums offers. These are the different types of drugs that we do test for. And you can see on the far side some of the illicits as well. Bath salts, how many of you have heard of bath salts? Okay, so that's something, again, that can't be tested with those instant read cups, but certainly with confirmation. So that's really important. So what I want to talk about, Mark, I promise I'll go through this quickly. I just want to do one case study. So if we could go ahead, I'll move forward with the case study so that we can kind of show you how this stuff works. There's so much I really wanted to get into talking about, but let's go ahead and talk about Brad. So then we'll conclude with Brad. So Brad is a 28-year-old man with chronic neck pain and shoulder pain that began 10 years ago. This is an old football injury. He reports his current regimen is not adequately managing his pain. How many of you have heard that? Right? This does happen. So current medication is oxycodone and ibuprofen. So keep those two in mind. This is the immunoassay, that instant read. He was negative for opioids, and again, the current medications are on the left. Opioids were negative, THC was positive. What would you do? Would you send this in for confirmation? Would you maybe fire this patient? What would you do with that result? Well, his clinician decided that she was going to send it in for confirmation. And this is what they found. So again, this is that liquid chromatography. Oxycodone positive, noroxy positive, oxymorphone positive, THC negative. Turns out that this patient was indeed following regimen. Where would the THC positive come from with that instant read? Exactly, the ibuprofen, the cross-reactivity. Very scary when you think about what could have happened to Brad. Maybe he was in a drug court. Maybe he was in something where he could have lost his family, etc., based on that decision. So again, I'm not a fear monger. Just know the limitations of the tests when you're moving forward. And so I have Steve, but I'll end with Brad. And I know that we don't have a lot of time for questions, but if we could entertain maybe one or two, and I'll also be available too at the back if there's more questions that you want to ask. So does anyone have a question that we can address quickly? Hi, brave soul. I think in the back.
A comment and a question. The comment is that you can use the opportunity with immunoassay dip testing to have a conversation with your patient. I view those as being worthless unless they are confirmed by what the patient tells you. So the day that you get the test, if there's an unexpected result on that, you can immediately talk to your patient and ask them to explain that. Right. And they may, at times, confirm what that test finds. So there is some value to it. The question was, has there been any more guidance or research done on the levels of alcohol metabolites as they relate to how much the patient is actually consuming?
Right, yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up. Again, please hear me. Both modalities have utility. So if you are using them, don't hear me as someone who's against the evil cup. Because certainly they do have, as you rightly pointed out, they do have utility. Just know the difference between what you're going to get. To answer your question about ethanol, or the metabolites, ETG and ETS are two of the metabolites that are primary from ethanol. And they reside in the system for about 80 hours after consumption. And so if you see them at around 10,000 nanograms per mil, that is a really safe estimate that your patient consumed 1 to 2 drinks the night before. So does that help answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And we can certainly talk more about those metabolites, et cetera, offline. But good question. Any other questions? All right.
Yes,
wait,
I had
Mark,
one
yay.
I know we had an interesting conversation before, but I just wanted to, what have you seen recently through UDS testing showing some drugs of abuse out there? They're common medications we all might need to be aware of about what patients may be asking for and not even think of it as being a drug of abuse. So
Right.
Can you mention some of them? I found it astounding. So
Right, good question. So what we're finding, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but we've been finding that Imodium is being misused. And what's happening is people have found out, and I affectionately call them street chemists, have found out that if you ingest copious amounts of Imodium, instead of addressing the peripheral opioid receptors, which help with motility, it's actually sort of overwhelming the system, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and activating the opioid receptors in the brain. So now we're getting a high, albeit somewhat stifled, but we're still getting a high from abusing Imodium. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Very hard to control because obviously it's an over-the-counter. So that's something that people are doing. They're pushing the limits of those peripheral receptors to start to activate what's going on in the brain. Another one that people are misusing, gabapentin, we talked about that. And we also talked about this particular substance called phenibut. Have any of you heard of phenibut? You may hear of this because on the Pacific Northwest, we had a couple cases where bodybuilders, essentially what phenibut is it's a natural GABA where the phenylated ring has been changed so that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and it activates the GABA receptors in the brain. what they're finding is that these, I was going to say muscleheads, that's not very nice. These folks that work out a lot that was a terrible slip, are ingesting gram quantities of phenibut. So they're flooding the system with GABA, which again, gabapentins and some of the benzos, et cetera, they may not be attaching to the GABA receptor per se, but they're interacting with it or involving that GABA receptor. What they're finding is instead of there being the breaks in the brain, which GABA is very famous for, it's the opposite effect. So now we had the one gentleman in my mind that I'm thinking of, he was very, very aggressive, very, very strong, not like a bath salt strong. When someone's on bath salts, they're ridiculously strong, but very, very aggressive, very strong. And he'd get to a point where he would be so anxious and uptight and yelling and screaming, and then he'd pass out. And in fact, even went into a coma. So this is not what we expect with people using a GABAergic properly. So it was almost like a paradoxical response. So again, be mindful of that if you overdo on the brakes side of things, you can start to see opposite responses. So that's another thing that people are abusing as well. And certainly, again, like I said, the list goes on, and I'd love to talk more about it, but those were two I wanted to highlight for sure. And I know that we're kind of running into Mark's talk, and I don't want to do that. So again, if you have additional questions, please see us at the back. We also have a booth if you're interested in the business side of things. And I want to thank you for your attention this afternoon. So thank you.
My name is Mark Mentel. I'm a DO. I'm also a family practice doctor and a faculty member at the Family Medicine Residency of Western Montana. I'm also have been the chairman for the committee on the planning here as well. And when you're the chairman, you have a chance to put yourself down and monopolize a whole afternoon. So if you kind of look at your schedule, you have me for most of this afternoon. I want to let you know I'm not here for the whole afternoon. This will actually go pretty quick. We have a few things we'll just do. I have a quick talk, something that's very near and dear to my heart, critical conversations. After that, we'll follow up with a breakout session that will take place right here in this room, and I'll go over those directions after. It's a follow-up exercise on what you all did yesterday, and I want to appreciate all the hard work you did there. After that, we'll have a brief conclusion, some thank yous, a drawing, and then you have time to just go, ah. Any of you are interested in ice cream, there's a wonderful ice cream place right down the road. So you can ask any of us who live here locally if you want to know where to go to maybe enjoy some of local Missoula's scenery. So I'm going to talk about critical conversations. If you note at the end of my title, I have a DO. And I think you had Dan McCarthy talk to you yesterday about what a DO is. One of the things it's a little unique is that as an osteopath, we have a certain amount of tenets that we strongly believe in that's kind of beaten into our brain, and we paid a lot of money to believe in that. One of those tenets is the body is a unit, and what that means to us is the body has several intricate parts that are so interrelated, you can't affect one part of the body without affecting another. The other is the person is a unit of body, mind, and spirit. The part I want to address is a spirit part. We heard a lot about body, mind, but we need to address the spirit. So I'll get into that here in just a second. My disclosures, I got nothing. There's nothing here that I have to disclose. Objectives, yep, just a little louder, I'm okay. This is, exactly, I learned from Pat Davis yesterday on how to operate this. Our objectives, I hope everyone after this little conversation can identify what a critical conversation is. I want you to understand why it's important to master this art of the critical conversation. And, yep, learned from Pat. And if you can learn some techniques to help master this. So my resources for where I'm speaking from, I wish I could say it was one individual resource, but it's a compilation. Can everyone hear me? Oops, just slow down. But what I've learned is a compilation of a lot of things throughout my career of how I've come to these conclusions. One is conferences, been to a lot of conferences, a lot of self-help stuff. My wife makes me go. Been to a lot of leadership development courses. I've also had a lot of great mentors who helped me and gave me some sage wisdom. And I've also been through the school of hard knocks, in with the patients, going round and round with them. And I've learned a little thing or two about how to avoid some of those traps. So step one that I have for everyone is learn how to identify when you're in a critical conversation. Critical conversations happen every day in our workplace. Most of the conversations that we go through aren't critical, but there's a certain percentage, probably less than 10% that occur through the day that can make the difference between your relationships with other people that you're working with, your patients, and the whole clinic as a whole. Take, for example, if you have someone, 90% of the time they say hello to you every morning, but every 10% of the time they're just, your impression of them is not the 90% of time that they say hello to you or nice. Your impression of them comes from that 10% of time they're not on their A game. This is what I always have to tell my kids who are teenage daughters, like, every time you get mad and angry and frustrated and do something, just that we have a hard time, you violate our rules, it takes a long time to rebuild that trust for us to regain that. So it's one of those things to keep in mind when you're having these critical conversations. So 3 entities to a critical conversation. These are high-stakes conversations. Usually one party or both parties are really invested in what's happening. There's opposing opinions, very strong opposing opinions, and very strong emotions on either side. Does this sound like any conversations that we have with patients who suffer from chronic pain, or patients who suffer with addiction, or patients who are just non-compliant with medication and medications that they're supposed to be taking, or treatment therapies? These are critical conversations. So I have some laws to the first step. My first law is the law of primal instinct. If you're in a conversation and all of a sudden you feel your fight or flight response kind of kicking in, like, I can't wait to get out of this room, I need to get the heck out of here, or if your hackles are going up on the back of your neck, you feel you're about ready to explode, you're probably in a critical conversation. I also have the pit in the gut law. I see this happen a lot of times with my residents. They see a patient who's coming in, they see him on the schedule, and they go, their stomach just like goes down. They got that pit in the gut. And so they're going to be heading into a critical conversation. And then I have my porta potty truck wreck law. Yes, it's porta potty truck wreck law. This is what happens when you're in a situation or the state of being where you say, oh crap, I'm in deep doo-doo. So let's take a look. I wasn't sure how that joke was going to go, so I appreciate at least we had some laughter. I really want to show this because what I want you to do is pay attention. We're going to take a look at a critical conversation that I found on YouTube. I think it's very poignant and points to the point of what we were trying to get to. And what you'll see, it's not with the pain patient or with the patient. It's actually between a husband and wife. But I have not had this conversation with my wife, so this is good. But I want you to pay attention to high stakes, opposing opinions, and strong emotions on either side. And see if you think this is a critical conversation. It might take me a few seconds here to get it loaded, so. Thank you.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. and I'm not sleeping very well at all, and all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
Yes. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking?
I hope you all like that. So what did you see there? That was a critical conversation that was taking place. I know I used it as a husband and wife example, but how many times does that look like when we're dealing with patients? When patients come in to see us, we are fixated on fixing what's wrong with them at that point in time. Our patients might not be ready for the fix at that point in time. They might want to just be heard or understood. They might not understand that the problem that we see might not be the problem that they think they have. And so you're probably not going to get anywhere. The likelihood of him recovering and getting that nail out of her head during that conversation, not going to happen. So the first rule was identify when you're in a critical conversation. I think he could have identified that, oh crap, here I am again, stuck in the same conversation, not going anywhere, and we're still talking about this darn nail. So the second step is I want you to remember the importance of why critical conversations are so important. This is mostly from workplace data, but these conversations form the foundation of a relationship that either produces results or trips up results. If you can get these, if you can master these, it's been shown in the business world, these conversations have been more effective in improving your results than technology improvement and process improvement. And I think of the world we work in healthcare. We have electronic health records. Great, I have this new technology. Do you think it's going to help, that new technology that tells me my patient's blood pressure is not controlled, is going to fix my blood pressure or my patient's blood pressure? Probably not. Do you think having a process in place that we identify all these people who aren't getting their blood pressure improved, sending them a letter saying your blood pressure is not to the point it should be, please make an appointment, that's probably not going to change results. What will change results is having a conversation with that patient, spending time with them, talking with them, finding out why they may not be taking their blood pressure medications, what they may be doing. So it's the art of managing that critical conversation that's so important. So I'm going to digress a little bit about this point, and it kind of centers me every time I go in with a patient, and I think of it as the big picture. I try to make sure that when I find myself in a critical conversations, I think of the overall big picture. I kind of will go into, when I first went into medical school, I'm going to kind of digress here and kind of bring you around to a point of view of where I think medicine should focus, or where we should be focusing our efforts, or kind of redirecting our thought process in medicine. When I initially went into medical school, and I remember during the interviews of why do you want to go into medicine, it was I want to save lives. You know, I want to make a difference in people's lives. I want to just change the world. As I've been in medicine for a while, I realized that that's probably not medicine and the medical profession's real role. I started thinking about it, and everyone is born with a terminal illness, and that terminal illness is life. We can't change that. At the end of my career, every one of my patients will pass away. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go dark here on you. I'll bring it back, trust me, I'll bring it back. But every one of them will pass away, and there's nothing I can do about it. You know, I might be able to forestall that and prevent, you know, early death, but in the long run, everyone is going to have a finite time on this planet. So what is it that we can do in medicine? We can actually change their quality of life and improve their suffering. We can change it so they're no longer suffering from what they can do. We can improve on their quality, make the human condition something a little more palatable so as they go through their finite span, they can enjoy it. And I really think that should be one of the main focuses. I have another, I didn't put it on here, I wish I did, but I call it my Sesame Street law. And I think we all can remember just a few of the people in our neighborhood, all those who remember the Sesame Street law. Every one of these patients who suffer, they're in our neighborhood. their quality of life and what they do, you know, if they're suffering out there, it's affecting our community. You know, they're not able to be productive, they're not able to be engaged, they're not able to do the things they want. If we can help those individuals in our neighborhood lift up their spirits, help bring them to a better state of being, we've done a lot for our community and for our neighborhood. So hopefully I brought that back and we're okay. We're not too dark and we're all thinking like, oh my God, I need to get out of here because I have a finite time here. So these are some of my laws of the big picture when I go in and I know I'm in these critical conversations. One is engineer the horizon point law. That's basically when I know I'm in a critical conversation, I step back and I think is, where is it I eventually want to get with this patient? I realize that during that conversation with the critical conversation, I'm not going to get anywhere at that visit. I'll get to one of my laws that tells me what I'm really looking for at that visit. But what I'm looking for is, where do I want to get that patient to, and how can I engineer that over several visits or developing a relationship with them that we can get to that point and maybe get to it together. There's a win-win law here. What you should be looking at, as opposed to focusing on opposing opinions, focus on what's not opposing and what things you can kind of work on. So take example for, you know, the YouTube video we just watched. Maybe as opposed to focusing on the nail in her head, you could have said, honey, you know, I really understand about those snags in your sweaters, and, you know, we might want to switch from crew neck sweaters and turtleneck sweaters maybe to V-neck, maybe to a nice cardigan. We'll see how that works and see if that improves those snags. But it's taking them to the point where they're getting a little better. It's kind of a stepwise approach. Mutual purpose law, just find a mutual purpose that you both can work on together during that critical conversation that becomes a positive thing as opposed to an opposing thing. And then I like to talk about the relationship law. And that's really what all you're trying to do when you get into a critical conversation and you realize it, maintain the relationship. That is the most important thing. You want to see if you can engage with them, see if you can develop a relationship with them that's mutual, that's respectful, that's trustful, and you can create an environment in which they feel safe and nurtured. Step 3. When you're in these, you want to make sure you control the narrative, control the tone, control yourself. I'm going to go into the limits of language and the origin of emotions. Trust me, there's a whole conference dedicated to this. But when we talk and when we listen and when we hear words and when we see words on a page, it creates a story or creates a picture in our head. That picture tells a story. That story then leads to a feeling, and that feeling leads to an action, usually out of us. It's that amygdala, that primal part of the brain that's all being driven. So if I were to say the word dog, I'm going to do this as an experiment. Everyone think of a dog right now in your head. Hopefully some of you already figured it out, but how many here thought of a golden retriever? Oh, come on. Okay, good. I got one person who likes two people like golden retrievers like me. Who thought of a Dachshund? Dalmatian. Who thought of sitting at Fenway Park eating a Coney dog? Okay, I heard dog. It's right after lunch. I'm still a little hungry. So that's where my mind went. But you can see how easy, just with non-specific words, how you can get different pictures of the same conversation. Now think of back to dog. So for me, I'm basking in the sun at Fenway Park with the Coney dog and everything's good. No, I won't talk about beer. So that word dog can evoke emotions on people. Some people may remember a time growing up and they just had this wonderful dog that was a family pet and just has great memories about it. Some people, when they hear the word dog, might think of a time when a German Shepherd attacked them, and they have negative emotions to it. And so for them, it emotes a reaction of like fear and terror. So we have to remember that when we're engaging in these conversations. Now, the see, hear, and tell a story, feel, and act, I'll kind of get into it with some of my residents, but I see it happen to them all the time before they go into a patient room. I'm thinking of a time, one of my residents had a new patient he was seeing. He saw on the chart, new patient coming from California, needs his morphine refilled. I'm not doing this. I am not going to refill this. I'm going to go in and I am not going to give them that medicine. There's no way they're getting that medicine. I'm not doing it. And inside, they were telling themselves this whole story of how this patient was a drug seeker coming in to get their drugs, and he's adhering to established care. He's going to misuse and abuse what I'm doing. You know, this is going to be a creep, someone I don't want to deal with. You know, he had this whole story in his head, and he's all worked up about it. And so he goes in there, stomping. I just watched the body language. He just went in there, stomping in. Lo and behold, a patient who's dying of terminal cancer. He just relocated to Montana to be with his family so he could spend his final days here. But that initial impression, the bristles hair, you can picture it, the bristles up on your back, going in there, probably did not help set the best tone and probably did not help to establish a good relationship from the get-go. A bad first impression. So here's some laws I have to control the narrative, control the tone, control yourself. One I have is be precise, be specific. Again, going back to the language, when you talk to a patient about things, be as precise and specific as you can. So to elude from people going down these different mental pictures that they're creating in their head from the ones you have in your head. I also try to teach people about the parachute law. Anyone know what that one is? I got some good laws here. Parachute law is, and I actually got this one from Rockin' Rudy's. And if anyone knows Rockin' Rudy's, it's a great store here in Missoula that has a lot of fun things in there. But this parachute law, it states your mind is like a parachute. It only works if it's open. So when you go in there with your mind already closed off, you've already shut out half the information that you need to process. The I and U vowel law. This is what I learned when I was a medical director. Anytime you're having these critical conversations, and I still struggle with this, try to avoid the words I and you. They carry a lot of judgment when you can use those words. I think you are using this drug in the wrong way. I try to replace it with we, us, our, them, and I try to refrain from that, and I try to keep it so I'm not talking about them as being the problem, but you know, if I have someone who has a urine drug scheme that comes back abnormal, I'll say, the urine that we tested showed this result. How can we change that or fix that? As opposed to going, I tested your urine and it came back with this. It creates a different tone. It creates a different way in which you can engage in a conversation. I'm going to skip the most important law because I want that one to be last. Control your own narrative law. And then again, when you find yourself in a critical conversation, you find your hackles raising up on the back of your head, this is a time to open up your mind, think about what happened, make sure you know the whole story before you start creating your own mental pictures. Understand that you create your own mental pictures as well and control those. Recognize when those emotions happen. Recognize that, whoa, I need to step back here. Okay. And the most important law, and if you can remember one from when you have these initial critical conversations, remember that the patient will most likely not remember anything you said during that critical conversation. What they will remember is how you made them feel. And I think that probably, if you could take one point home with you, is that if you can create an environment during these critical conversations where they at least feel safe, feel they can come back, and they can come back and re-engage in a conversation, I think you would have accomplished a lot. Step 4, recognize when you screwed up. These are kind of some clues you might be able to figure out when you screwed up. One is the silence defense crying law. If you see your patient kind of shutting down, becoming silent, or you see him becoming defensive, or you see him crying, and especially crying, you probably messed up the critical conversation, and you need to recognize that, digress, come back, and try to re-engage and get onto a better plane. This is probably one of the most important points, the gosh shucks, I'm sorry law. This just basically says, you know, this conversation isn't going where we would like it to go. I'm really sorry about what's happening. Can we refocus and can we get back on a better plane, or can we come back another day and do this in a better way so I can do a better job? Don't be afraid to tell your patient sorry. I think that's a very important skill and something we need to learn to do in a way that can rebuild these relationships. And then I also talk about the disagreeable law. This is the statement that it's okay for us to disagree, but it's not okay for us to be disagreeable. And so a lot of times what I'll have the conversation, I'll recognize we might have some different opinions, and that's okay. Let's focus on what we can and see if we can build a relationship out of this. My last step, be honest. Patients can tell when you're BSing them or saying you're going to turn them into the police when you're probably not going to, or do something like that. I like the don't lie or you're going to HE double hockey sticks law. I learned that one when I was going through Catholic training. And then the want-need law. This is one of the things I like to talk about. This is how when I'm having a hard time with the patient, and I also call it a little bit of my Rolling Stone law. We all remember the Rolling Stones, I think. You can't always get what you want, but if you try real hard, you might get what you need. I just try, if you try real hard, they might get what they need. So that's kind of what you want to do with some of these conversations is, you want to get them, they might not know what they want, but you might want to get them to where they need to go. And then I challenge you for the rest of the day trying to get that song out of your head. So, and I also do this with the want-need law, and I kind of do, the good, doctor or the good person inside of me wants to do this for you, and this is one of the little training rules I kind of teach some of my residents. So the good person inside of me wants to do this for you, but the doctor who you came to see says this might be a better option, and this is my opinion as a doctor. So kind of separating that out. And if you don't like steps, I also have this mnemonic. I learned this one from Brian Wong with the Bedside Trust. And he really wants, I don't know if anyone has ever met Brian Wong or have seen him speak, but he's like a $10,000, $20,000 a day speaker. He does a lot of organizational review of major hospital systems, trying to change the culture within those hospitals. And he's real committed to the patient-centered approach to medicine. His mnemonic is trusted. And when I deal with most medical professionals, I can't say most, but a lot of I would say all medical professionals are TEDs. They're talented, they're knowledgeable, they got great judgment, they're proficient, they execute, they get things done, they get results, they're dedicated, they got a work ethic. When a patient comes to see you, anyone in the medical profession, they already expect that. What they want is a truss, not the kind of truss you wear for a hernia, but what they want is a doctor they can be a team player with them that makes me and the others feel better. They want a doctor who's responsible, or I shouldn't say doctor because I gotta remember this interdisciplinary, but they want a medical professional to work with them that's responsive and respectful. They also want a medical provider who's understanding, listens, and learns without judgment. And they want someone who's safe, easy to approach, and invites the opinion of the other provider, and invites their opinion in. And really, when you think about this, the art to the critical conversation is to maintain dialogue, maintain trust, make a safe area for patients to feel safe and nurtured in. I can only imagine if we could all master that. I think of if I give someone a blood pressure medicine in an environment where it's just like, here's your medicine, go on your way, where there's no nurturing, but an environment where they feel nurtured and safe, I'm probably going to get better results with whatever treatment I give or whatever medication I prescribe. If done in a caring environment, I think could make a big difference for a lot of patients, especially those who suffer from pain and are suffering. So that concludes my short talk. Thank you. Next is each one of you should have a number on your table, and you should look and see if you have a number on your badge. What you want to do, and if you don't have a badge number, which I saw someone shaking their head, find a table that has fewer people. What we'd like to do is get about 5 to 6 people per table. Go around the table individually and introduce yourselves of who you are, what your medical discipline is, and where you're from. Can we have the representative from table 1 stand up and let us know what caught your eye as regard to an issue and beneficence of all those issues related, and a solution if possible, or a direction that we can head. It's not working. Well,
Hello. Okay, yeah. Just had to push the power button, I guess. We did not get to solutions. Sorry, we don't have a solution for you. But in Beneficence, the theme we saw emerge was lack of resources and skills available.
Okay. So, I mean, really, you can think about that. The solution would be that.
Training and more education.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so lack of resources and skill, and the solution might be we need more training and education of, I would imagine, primary care providers, because we're talking about that. Would that be reasonable to kind of go with?
Primary care?
Yeah.
Any care?
Any care, okay. Of any care that can help us. So I think that would be an appropriate one. Thank you.
Shall I continue, or are you going?
Yep, if we can, we have Paige who will take it around. Table 2, it looks like Table 2 and Table 3 kind of combined there, so good choice.
All right, we identified that kind of one of the overarching solutions to the beneficence problem was using best practice, which is defined as being holistic and also collaborative. We felt like one of our individual solutions under using best practice was to utilize a collaborative approach. That means both with patients and clinicians and with clinicians and clinicians. And then we, even though that was a solution, we came up with a problem to that, which was how do we collaborate, particularly in an environment where the resources are limited. We felt like another component of using best practice was the importance of educating providers, but also educating patients on what best practice for pain management is.
Excellent. And I think we all recognize that after this conference, that really the collaborative spirit of we kind of get siloed and our ability to kind of work together to better enable that patient is not there. And also talking the same language for the patient so they hear a consistent story across the spectrum, I think is important. So, yep, right on target. So, table 4.
Well, I guess we're table 7, but we'll
Okay.
So the one that we started talking a little bit more was adequate diagnosis, and that was sort of a mixture of things of making sure we're diagnosing them, but also having that more in-depth risk assessment and having some of those critical conversations and expectations up front, and how there's a time barrier and how there's a reimbursement barrier. And we didn't quite get to spend a whole lot of time on solutions, and so some of the quick possible solutions we talked about was just sort of administrative efficiency, so making sure that the medical team understands and values these challenges so that we're being able to have significantly long periods of time to be working with these patients to get this done up front, but then also the need of probably multi-level advocacy that can hopefully increase reimbursement and make sure our medical system's structured in a way that makes sure that we're doing the most good for our patients.
I think that's a great one. I'm glad to see that one popped out. You know, there's a lot of things that can be done with insurance reform, talking to legislators, talking to insurance carriers, trying to get the idea that spending a little more time with these individuals may actually save the system a heck of a lot more money and do a lot better for our communities. And I see where this is going with all these. It's really hard to pick one thing in regard to beneficence. A lot of them blur in, so I'm glad you guys realize that as well. I had a hard time doing this exercise with myself, so. Next table.
So we looked for commonalities across disciplines, and the one we focused on was lack of continuity, coordination, and communication, partly because the other ones seemed to have systemic answers, and that seemed beyond us. But so we talked about solutions like when we refer somebody to a specialist, to send a letter along with that about what we've already done, what we've tried, and what our experience with the patient has been. To build into our documentation a communication strategy, for example, to talk about the conversation we had with the patient when making the referral, so it's easy for the receiving person to understand what happened, and also to make sure that we get information back to a referral source. So this is probably more when folks are practicing in different settings to enhance communication.
Yep. So communication is right on board, and one of the areas I'm thinking about is right now we have electronic health records that are unable to talk, and we have electronic health organizations or electronic medical record companies that don't want to create the software that allows those to interact. That is definitely a barrier to our ability to communicate. And we also have EMRs that are inefficient. And I remember prior to the time when I was practicing before EMRs, there was a lot of time spent on the phone with other providers, and I don't see that happening as much. I know electronic health records can be a help, but they can also be a hindrance, and we probably need to redirect that, but right on board with the communication, great. Next table.
We felt that really a lot of the problem was that patients are not, really getting sometimes the best treatment because of limited resources. Resources that are limited are our time, patient and provider education, associated or necessary resources may not be available in the communities that we're in. Reimbursement was an issue, and again, when we really came down to looking at solutions, we thought that kind of the reimbursement may be part of the problem that needs to be addressed. That we didn't think as a group that single payer types of things would be a solution to the problem, but looking at a way of making reimbursement more equitable relative to the amount of time that we have to spend and the amount of resources that we have to utilize. We're dealing with patients that require a lot more time and a lot more resources, and comparatively, your reimbursement to people goes down. The more time you spend, the less you get reimbursed.
It's inversely proportional, yeah. And I think that is something that probably can be addressed if the idea is we kind of can get this posted up, we can get these items listed, and this is something that maybe legislation might pay attention to, that maybe we can do some reform, maybe some things like that can happen so we can actually get going with better reimbursement schemes. Great. Next table.
I'll speak for this group. We talked about a number of things. I think that also came up of reimbursement for our group, and potentially talking about advocating for Medicare or Medicaid reimbursing alternatives, so things like acupuncture or reimbursement, or making a standard of care be that behavioral health is included from the beginning rather than in the 10th visit or something along those lines.
Excellent.
Briefly.
Yep. Kind of hitting on the theme that we do in medicine what we get paid to do. And if we had a reimbursement system that was a little different, maybe we would change the healthcare system of how we deliver care. So, excellent.
We also talked about a number of different things, but the main theme that came up was both a lack of communication and integration between all of the different disciplines, and secondly, lack of time, which in the end relate to lack of money to pay for it. And
yeah,
we thought maybe the lottery? I just thought of that.
A great solution. we could have a healthcare lottery. So I think they had something like that. I can't remember if it was Washington or Oregon, where they had enrollment period. They could only get so many people enrolled in a certain amount of time. Not really lottery, but it's kind of like that. So, and next table.
Okay, so we also looked at integration, and in order to foster that collaboration and communication, no more silos, or it takes a village to deal with chronic pain. So we talked about having a standard of care similar to the prior speaker, talking about integration of behavioral health, physical therapy, alternate therapies, nursing, PCPs, all getting involved from the get-go as a team. Also, the need to improve communication, and one idea we had about difficult conversations would be to train people, maybe not in behavioral health, but in other disciplines, specifically PCPs, in motivational interviewing, to make it easier to converse. Also having chronic pain-only visits, so the patient does have time to be heard, not dealing with chronic pain, diabetes, asthma, high blood pressure.
Nice, great. Next table.
So we kind of talked about adequate diagnosis and what that meant to the patient. It all ties back to time, it's sounding, I mean, from all of this, and just the time that it takes to educate the patient, and realizing sometimes we learned back in school, we talk about it's a patient with a stroke, not a stroke patient, and sometimes we throw diagnoses on patients and then they identify with that instead of their own self. So just the amount of time to educate the patient that, boy, we're in the diagnostic process too, we're not really sure, but I'm going to send you home with things and this can be diagnostic for us. And then do they feel, I loved your last talk, just is the patient feel safe? Do they feel nurtured? And the amount of time that we spend with them is just critical, but then we run into the coding and then we're run by insurance companies. You can only have 8 visits with a patient, so that's just kind of a, I don't know if it's going to be an unending battle, but.
Main thing is, I think if we start talking about it and come together with consensus and when we can come to large groups, you know, I'm a big believer that if we have enough people stating the same things and there's more healthcare providers in the country than there are insurer carriers. We have within ourselves capability to change, but we just have to be unified in our source. So things like this is important, I think we talk about.
So we're going to be redundant.
I don't
with
think there's any redundancy.
Access to care, financially, education, to get the most optimal care treatment patient. And what my ideal solution to it is that Montana develops a multidisciplinary clinic program, like 28-day program that patients can go to and get adequate pain care management. You'll be surprised how many, when patients go to these programs, they suddenly don't have personality disorders when they come back from them.
Interesting.
If we can get the insurance to reimburse for such a thing and do a centralized Montana pain program, I think that would be one solution. And do an echo program for pain.
Yeah.
I think that would really help with some of the rural settings of being more comfortable managing pain, just somebody to bounce ideas off with and deal with difficult patients. But right now, our patients have limited resources and the doctors feel stuck and providers feel stuck. And so ideally, that would be my idea.
Excellent ideas. Those are wonderful. I have never heard that one before about thinking about a pain program for state or for patients in the state who might be having really tough issues to go to as a place. And that's a wonderful idea. I really like that idea. And then an echo program, I think, is something that we should be able to do in the state if we get the right resources, right funding, and grants and other things. So these are great ideas. Wonderful. Next group.
So we talked about the theme of lack of willingness to prescribe due to lack of resources and education. There's a lot of fear, rightfully so, from the patients that they're going to find it increasingly more difficult to get adequate pain management, whether that's with opioids or without. There is increasing fear on the prescribing side due to new guidelines, fear of harming patients due to all the things in the news, fear of punitive steps due to new guidelines. And we talked about the fact that the fear is driven on the prescriber's side sometimes by lack of knowledge.
Right.
Because not all prescribers have a big knowledge base about monitoring opioid therapy and treating chronic pain. And then we talked about, well, we have some pretty good resources that were developed through the Montana Medical Association.
Right.
And how do we get those to be utilized more to improve the comfort level of prescribing healthcare providers to monitor those medications appropriately and treat chronic pain appropriately with less fear? because we can't rely on specialists to do it. There's one of me for every 30,000 people with chronic pain. And as you've been preaching this whole weekend, it needs to be with the primary care physician.
Yes.
And so we have to make sure that the scope of the problem is understood and that we try to lessen the fear of the prescribers. And another thing that came up with our group is we need some more support, or prescribers need some support from their state boards and their state associations saying, these are the guidelines that we feel you should follow, and if you do, you should be fairly safe. So figuring out a way to incentivize prescribers to access those resources to improve their comfort level and therefore provide better care to more patients.
Yes,
Because the scary thing for me is that, as we've heard from the patients this weekend, I think there'll be a lot of people potentially harmed by
Yes.
the guidelines because prescribers are stepping away completely.
Yep.
Or setting absolutely hard limits, and it's concerning.
Yeah, I looked at the same CDC guidelines, Camden, and it's a one-pager, and most people are going to take that as law and not as these are just recommendations or kind of general opinions. But when you read through the entire, I can't remember, 30 to 40 pages I read through them. It took me a couple days because I fell asleep during some of it. But you realize it's not based on really great evidence. It's based on mostly opinion and really poor studies. And it was more of a political guideline, I think, than it was a scientific guideline. So.
But as we've already started to see, it's being taken by certain practices and
Yes.
certain groups as being
right.
Not law, but certainly more than a guideline.
So this is something that I'm thinking that maybe the Board of Medicine here in the state could weigh in on and say, and kind of give a little better direction and clear direction for our physicians or doctors or medical providers in the state. If I'm kind of on the right track with that.
Oh,
is
yeah.
that- Yeah. Okay.
And I think, just to one point I don't think I made very well was a little more awareness for the toolkits that are available through
Yep.
the Know Your Dose website and advertising that more, because I think if physicians and other prescribers knew about, what organizations said were best practices outside of the CDC guidelines, or even, some of them overlap, but if there was that understanding, that comfort level, I think prescribers would be a lot better equipped to treat people with chronic pain.
I agree. And I'm going to put a little plug in. This is an advertisement, but it's for the Montana Medical Association. I was privileged to work with Dr. Nealand, and I know Dr. Scott Stainer was here a little bit ago, and Dr. Bill Galley. And if you can at least get the message out that there is a website through the Montana Medical Association, it's free CME to learn how to prescribe in a way that's patient-centered, patient-focused, that takes care of the patient. And we had two experts here in the state kind of putting it into our state value system, Dr. Scott Stainer from Billings and Dr. Camden Nealand from up in Kalispell. And they have great programs going and very caring doctors for their patients. So if you can at least get the word out that there is a program, free CME, that people can go to, and it's just knowyourdosemontana.org, that would be great. Next table.
Us being last, we're pretty much ditto. But just to add on to it, I guess the one thing we'd say is we looked at the different perspectives on what's good, and I think in all this that we're talking about bringing the multidisciplinary groups, whether it's all in one office or whether it's figuring out your connections through your community or through your state, but is to settle on with the patient what is good for them and make sure that that same goal is being used through the whole system so that everybody's working towards the same goal.
Great. And I think we can all see, as we've gone through this exercise, there's a lot of things that kind of come to the foreground of really what's standing in the way of doing the best for our patients. So this is great. I think we had one more table, though.
I think ours were said multiple times already, but the first one was just the importance of addressing the multidisciplinary team approach, especially in places smaller towns that don't always have access to that, and so how to put that in place. And then the second was, because of the new CDC guidelines, and we are talking about sort of generational differences, not only amongst practitioners, but also patients, and the need for a public awareness campaign in terms of just, educating the public about what some of the new guidelines are and what is a standard of care, if we can all agree on that.
Okay, so public education about what is possible with, if I'm getting it right, what is possible with our current state of medical science, and based some public education about the new guidelines as well. Okay, excellent. I think that was it for the first go-around. We're going to go back in and do the same exercise now for non-malfeasance and see how that goes, and I'll give you 10 minutes on that one. So, believe it or not, after this exercise is done, I'm going to excuse everyone, so it's not going to be that. So. All right, we're going to start wrapping up here, and we'll go to table 1. Or actually, let's start the other way this time, so table 1 doesn't get all the glory on setting things. I know that Dr. Haney, she likes to do that, so. We'll go reverse order this time.
You guys.
Before we start, we do have a set of keys that was found out on one of the vendor tables. It looks like it's to a Honda. It's got 4 keys on it and the electronic key. So if anyone's missing any keys or has a Honda that they would like to take home with them, let me know. Table 16, we'll start with you. Or the...
All right. We kind of played off from where we were last, but basically, as autonomy goes, we talked about focusing first on the goal and not on the process or or anything else, but to focus that the patient is clear on what they want, what their goal is, what they're trying to do, and then work from there the process with understanding of the limitations that might be around, whether they be the limitations of the ability of the provider, limitations of resources around the community, limitations of insurance, et cetera, but always focusing on the goal.
Nice. So make sure the patient is aware of the goal, set common goals together, and be aware of what you can do in your environment where you're working. So, great.
For autonomy, we were talking about, in particular, the lack of trust, lack of knowledge, and kind of came back to the importance of the patient feeling like they're listened to, and then the constraint of there's not enough time. So trying to bring in other ways of helping the patient feel that they're listened to. So some thoughts were having the nurse do part of that initial listening and providing more history to the doctor before they go into the room. And then even things like in one clinic, so having like a new patient intake form that has all that information on it, but the patient doesn't do that at the time of the visit, they do it ahead of time so that they feel like they've really been able to talk through all of those issues and had time to think about it ahead of time so they don't get there and say, oh, I forgot what some of my questions were, some of the things I wanted to address. And this one particular clinic does it by phone, so that they don't run into the issue of, oh, the patient forgets to bring the papers in with them after they've already completed it at home. And it can be even like a 45-minute conversation between the nurse and the patient on the phone before their first visit.
Nice. So a lot of pre-visit planning of kind of getting to that. So a way that they can access a system and even talk to a real person on the other end. Nice. Not have to hit buttons of like, if you need this, hit one. Okay, great. Next.
So ditto, a couple of other thoughts about ways to, so we talked about the lack of trust, the lack of knowledge, the gap between the knowledge of the healthcare provider and the patient based on why we're making these recommendations and how you have to take time to build that trust so they know that you're not making the recommendations because you think they're a drug addict or they're making it up or whatever. But you have to take the time to educate the patient as well. And some of the things that we didn't talk about as a group, but I just thought, in our clinic, even though we have time dedicated just to chronic pain, we've utilized things like videos and books and more group sessions for education. So I think what we talked about here was at the very first visit with the patient, making sure that there's time devoted to understanding that person, what their goals are, and taking opportunity to educate them about an introduction to your philosophy about treating chronic pain. But it's critically important to make sure that the patient not only trusts you, but has a level of understanding about why you're making the recommendations. We can't expect them to have all the medical knowledge that we do, but a good summary of it, an opportunity for them to understand is really important.
Yeah, good. Agree wholeheartedly. I think that's a great issue. You know, a lot of times when we really think of autonomy, it's really informed consent, spending your time, taking your time with your patient, talking with them. But so many times it just equates down to a piece of paper you sign, have them read through and just initial, and you never even have that conversation. So I think it's important. The informed consent is a conversation. It's not a piece of paper that's signed. So, and I know it kind of went a little off, but again, right on, yeah. Next group, please.
Okay, so we talked about, of course, the lack of time and coordination of care for providers and for patients for help of getting informed care, understanding risks and benefits, and lack of knowledge from the insurance companies, the providers of all types, and patients. Solutions we came up with come out of somewhat of my own practice, where I'm big into patient autonomy and patient accountability, where inpatient unit, we're changing that and doing safety plans at discharge. So when the patients, if they come back, what'd you try, what you didn't try, da-da-da. One of the things that may be helpful, we came up with 3 things. So one, a video for patients. Maybe Montana can make a video for patients that would help primary care providers. I think patients are more apt to watch a video than read a piece of paper generally. If you have a video that Montana came up with that your provider has identified you as a chronic pain patient, this is and it would talk in general terms about chronic pain and what can be expected, and that the goal of treatment of chronic pain is function, not pain, necessarily pain relief, generalized of what you could expect, and the risk and benefits, a little bit about opiates and other medications. And then a video to train providers to maybe use the video, and also, so they also know what the goal of pain management is, of increasing functioning, not decreasing pain necessarily. So 2 different videos, one for providers of all types, and one for patients that offices could use. Because I know offices are time crunched, and it's nice to develop your own things, but it's also very hard to do that. And then looking at maybe examples of pain contracts, of framing things in a positive way, where, you know, at the onset, you state you are to the patient, you are responsible for your own wellness.
Nice.
And I am one of the tools in assisting you in this resource, and I will work with you in achieving the wellness. And so maybe looking at different pain contracts and how to frame that in a more positive light rather than negative light of what the goal is here, and having patients feel more powerful, empowered to make their own decisions.
Yeah, excellent. You know, one of the things I'm glad the pain contracts came up, or pain agreements, just because a lot of times they're used as punitive measures and things. You signed this contract, you violated it, therefore I'm done with you. And I don't think that's the way they should be used. I think they should be used like that, as this is what we hope to accomplish together, and encourage each one of you working together. So excellent point. Next group.
We discussed how, as far as patient autonomy goes, that the patient has the right to make decisions regarding their own health care, informed decisions, but the challenge is that they don't understand a lot of what's going on, and that it would be fabulous if we had the patient at the table, but behavioral health was also at the table from the get-go, and then behavioral health would no longer be stigmatized as now we think you're nuts, but it's just part of the standard of care. This is what we do if you have chronic pain and you're on an opioid. We have the whole team, you're at the table, the rest of the people are at the table. And then the goal setting happens, and that way it just seems like it would kind of move forward. The other thing we talked about was how important it is to include pharmacy and to help them understand why the patient is on these medications so that they can make better recommendations both to the patient and help us, and also physical therapy, who gets a lot of referrals without knowing exactly what in the holy heck is going on. So
you hit on a topic that's kind of my ultimate dream, kind of near and dear dream, is what you're kind of referring to, and I think it's great, is kind of like what we do with a cancer patient. They have a cancer, a team of specialists get together, sit down and discuss what's the best course of action with this patient. And it's usually pharmacy, surgeons, everyone getting together and have a conversation. And I think that would be a great thing if we could find a way to create those multidisciplinary treatment teams prior to anyone having a significant procedure done that has significant harm or benefits to it. I think it's a great idea. Actually, everyone's got a great idea, so.
Ours is a lot of overlap. We just talked about, the patient coming in and making sure that you spend the time to educate them on what you can provide for them. And I love just I just realized as I was talking this out in my head, the I and the you language, here's what we can do together, here's what I can provide for you.
With the I have the same problem. Here's what I can, it's a really hard thing to practice that conversation. I get it wrong all the time.
It totally is. But here's what we could do together. Here's the plan of attack. Set that up for them and then say, okay, what would you like? And then realizing, especially in rural Montana, I know just as a PT, then they're going to have to drive 45 minutes into the clinic. Boy, maybe right now you would, respond well to some myofascial release and some manual therapy, but at this time, you've got life, you've got 2 kids, you've got a ranch, and so let's get you home, let's get you on a home exercise program. How do you feel about that? And just using those questions to educate the patient and making it their choice. So.
Great. Next table.
You're going to find a lot of overlap with what we're talking about, but I just wanted to add, in addition to cancer teams, in my case, I had a spinal cord injury, and I spent 3 months in a rehab hospital, Craig Hospital in Englewood, Colorado. And I love the fact I had a team behind me, that we would meet regularly. It'd be me, my doctor, my physical therapist, my occupational therapist, and my counselor. So I think that's a great idea.
So you're kind of going together with like a group visit where you have the team there together with
and
the patient.
And the patient was I was part of it. So in terms of, we also saw that to give patients more autonomy, they need to be able to make informed decisions. So we also talked about education to empower, listen, validate, educate, with a great side benefit of building trust, both of the patient towards the provider, but also the provider towards the patient, kind of that therapeutic relationship.
Nice. Next table.
So in treating patients in a way that really requires a multidisciplinary approach means that we really have to look at how we educate each other, and that we have to be willing to learn from each other. And once we've done that, at least in our own setting, then kind of what we need to look at, for instance, is how do we disseminate this information then? So for instance, looking at what they've done with the approach in the pain clinic here in Missoula, how can our group in Miles City look at that and start to implement some of what they've done? And again, we thought that once we got past that process of developing ways to disseminate information, what we've learned, then how do we prioritize, or reward people then for using that? Is there a way to put this into a format that will give people, continuing education credits for, going to this forum and looking and.
Yeah, so I'm kind of hearing 2 things if I got it right. Some way we can share resources of big centers, sharing resources with smaller centers, and then a place, one kind of place where everyone can go for a repository of information. If I kind of, to look for one spot so it's not all separated, so.
And to be rewarded for going there.
Like getting CME credits if you go. No, great ideas, thank you. Next group.
Just echoing what other people said, talking about informed or knowledgeable consent, that we want patients to make their own choices, but we want them to know what the options are. And I think in addition to educating patients, we were just talking about making sure that providers were educated about the other options so that they can describe them in a meaningful way. Because I think how you make that warm handoff or how you make that referral might well determine whether somebody chooses that option too.
Excellent, yep. Setting the patient up for what to expect when they go to the next step so they kind of know what's going to happen. So it's kind of the left hand knowing what the right hand's doing. And it's one of those things that kind of goes back to communication again. How do we work together as a team of providers kind of working separate from one another, working together? So excellent, yes. Next table.
We were also talking about information sharing between the different disciplines. And we were trying to come up with some sort of platform that was fairly small and just summarizing the treatment plan for the different disciplines so that, and it would still be accessible, well, for one discipline to see what the other was up to, and then the patient would also have access to that too, so they could be reminded of what everybody was thinking.
Awesome.
Anything else?
Good, next table. And believe it or not, the Montana Medical Association is trying to build that for providers, a place, one-stop shopping kind of place for providers and patients to go to for information. But it's still growing, still needs to be built, and we're still trying to get more information out there about that. So, excellent.
Cool.
But these are great ideas I can take back to the MMA and say these are things we need to work on. So, yeah.
So we were talking a lot about patient education and empowerment as well, and sort of making sure they have a reasonable selection of choices in the biopsychosocial model, and how we can decrease barriers to that model by just being aware of what other providers are doing and what they're doing in our practice, but also in our community, so we can do that warm handoff that was already mentioned. And also the use of motivational interviewing to sort of understand what the patient's goals are, what our goals are, and setting up those expectations up front so we can really make sure they know how those options fit into their goals as well as ours. And also the possibility of bringing the family into the education too, and sort of having that support to help them make the best choices for themselves.
Nice touch. Having the family support at home, supporting the individual patient or the person with pain, knowing the family is behind them, I think is a really important thing. So I think that's a really key point to autonomy. I think it's wonderful. Yeah, next.
Yeah, we feel lucky that we're ditto to everybody. A collaborative approach. I think that Western medicine, this is probably more my idea than it. I've always been interested in the acupuncture and the different kind of things if we educate ourselves, but definitely the education of the patient, because it's an autonomy thing. They need to know their options and stuff, and that's our responsibility. That's pretty much.
Last table.
It was a ditto for us, educating patients so they can make the right choice. But one thing that came up at our table was a possible public service campaign in Montana to kind of set the stage for expectations for who's on a pain team and what does pain treatment look like.
Excellent. I know there is some money on a huge settlement that occurred at the state level, that getting like attorney generals or other people backing a public campaign would be a wonderful thing if we can get that going. Put a little political pressure, so awesome. The last one, justice. One more. And after that, I promise you we will wrap things up and we will conclude this conference. So 10 minutes just on the justice aspect, and then we'll go through the results, and we should be out of here by 3:30, an hour and a half ahead of schedule. Okay, first table here, we got someone who's ready to go.
I'll see if I can put this together. One of the biggest problems we have is access to care, and it has to do with money and reimbursement. So we thought that somehow changing the reimbursement model, but the other things that were a little more creative were the use of less expensive things like videos and telehealth and for follow-up and stuff too. Heck, we have the IT stuff to do Skyping and that kind of thing. And one of the ideas was for an example, like someone might not have a computer, but maybe they could work it out. Like the example was the healthcare provider's in Havre, but their pharmacy is somewhere else in a rural area.
Sure.
And they could go to the pharmacist to communicate with the healthcare provider, or I don't know, just trying to make it more equitable, and building a collaborative approach through the whole state, so distance collaboration, since we have all the computers and stuff now, somehow have some kind of network that way.
Great, so
Did I say it right?
So trying to, again, kind of share resources. We have limited resources in Montana. How do we make those available so everyone has equal access? So, yes.
We talked about the possibility of also having specialty groups collaborate and come up with concepts that could be shared with especially the rural areas in Montana. And the same ideas with IT, because now that we have technology, we may not still be able to pick up the phone and call a specialist we know, but maybe they would have access to some information that they could share with us through technology.
Excellent.
Don't you guys want to be on call more?
We can always record it.
So our group talked about some similar things of some of the issues just with logistics and payment, and we talked a bit about how can we support a patient-centered model even in situations where everyone on their healthcare team might be spread out throughout Montana, and how can we utilize technology to really improve the service that we can provide and really provide what patients deserve, which is them at the center, their health as the most important focus there. And how can we build payment models and medical system models that sort of support the development of that and sort of the most impact for patients' health.
Right, kind of getting that shared resources, IT resources lined up so there's more equability, if that's a word, across the whole spectrum. Great. Common theme kind of emerging, so.
Very similar stuff, changes in how insurances reimburses and different payment models. Certainly thinking about access in rural areas, things like consultants and telehealth. And we also took the long view and thought about workforce development, that kind of like the residency, where if folks do their post-grad training, they might be more likely to stay. Maybe we can think about training opportunities for other disciplines to recruit our own students to stay in the state and go to some of these underserved communities.
Excellent. If we can train providers here in the state for what the standards we need for the state, that's going to be a much easier ability than to have people from outside the state fill the holes with this disparate group. So, excellent. So yay to medical education here in the state. So, yeah, go ahead.
We also spoke about the access to health information in our rural state, and telehealth. We kind of ended our conversation speaking to maybe a similar program, such as there's assistance if you need help heating your house or access to a cell phone, perhaps reducing costs of internet access to people in rural areas that are particularly high risk or vulnerable population, to facilitate face-to-face communication with their physicians or pharmacists or other members of the healthcare team.
Awesome. Never thought about making internet access more affordable for those in rural areas that need to have that access. Awesome idea. Next group.
We identified really kind of a couple issues that we thought were important. One is the fact that just recognizing that this is an area where there is a lot of bias and working at trying to eliminate that. And one of the things that we thought was extremely important is just being proactive about speaking up with our peers about, and addressing, bias when we see it.
Nice.
The other thing that we thought was kind of a barrier to justice in the system is really kind of revolving around payment and reimbursement. That when you see, for instance, services that would be very efficacious and you get this blanket, well, insurance doesn't cover that.
Right.
Having something like doctor-to-doctor lines or using case managers, to kind of be able to to do something about that, I think would certainly be helpful. And having a push on the part of our professional societies to kind of work with insurance carriers to kind of develop ways that we can improve communication, that I could point out to an insurance carrier that this is actually cost-effective to do. It shouldn't be a blanket denial.
So I'm kind of putting things into my own brain. So I'm hearing case management, having someone really be a patient advocate to actually help fight for their, because a lot of times we're busy in practice and we don't have the ability to do that. So more case management for probably a lot of those harder cases, so have that access. I'm also hearing something else that's kind of near and dear to my heart was what you were talking about, eliminating bias, stigmatization, and stereotyping. And, I think one of the things we need to think about is the way people look at persons with chronic pain, they need to look at the same way as persons with diabetes. It's chronic disease management. And any diabetic I've ever known has always cheated on their diet. So every person with chronic pain will cheat on their pain meds. I know that for a fact. And so, the goal is to kind of try to help them manage their disease the best they can, kind of bring them back in. And so we need to get, again, educating providers, think of it as a chronic disease state that needs to be managed over time, not here's your meds are gone. So, excellent. Next group.
Okay, I'm going to leverage off of what you two were just talking about. Also talking about access as a justice issue. The war on pain. There was a war on pain. I think it was mainly produced by Purdue Pharma and OxyContin. This time around, not about drugs, but about effective treatment and getting government and insurance involved, citing the vast number of people and the huge societal costs involved with this. And to prove this, I want everybody, if you know someone, not professionally, but in your personal life or yourself who has dealt with chronic pain, please raise your hand now. Enough said.
Thank you. I've done that little experiment before. It's pretty cool to see how many lives are touched by chronic pain. So,
we kind of went along with what other people have said too, lack of resources and availability of resources on an equal basis, based on funding being one of the people aren't equal with funding resources. If you have Medicare or you have Medicaid, you may not have access to some treatment modalities. Also, if you're in a rural area, you have lack of access also. We also talked about having a good, solid, informed consent entrance plan and exit plan as your discharge or as your treatment plan. So that way, the patient is informed of what this is the plan in place. We're going to try this out. If it doesn't work for whatever reasons it is, this is our exit plan and this is what we're going to try next. So that way, kind of going along with a lot of providers afraid to prescribe opiates. If they are prescribing opiates and they don't have an exit plan and how to get rid of the person, or the problem, I should say, because the person is actually, we're discharging you because you failed your pain contract. That's not a fair exit plan for the patient.
No.
And so by having a good entrance and exit plan based on your treatment modalities, I think is important.
Yep, the justice part of let's kind of stop kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
Exactly, and let's start working together and kind of helping these patients, because even if they are having issues, that's another type of suffering I'm thinking of. They might have addiction issues, other things, that we need to embrace them and bring them in the fold, because they're still suffering. But it's not because they have a lack of medicine, it's they don't need the medicine and need help getting off that, so.
Yeah.
Excellent.
We came up with the exact same thing everyone else came up with, which was access to care. And for us, we also talked about the fear of the providers in prescribing. So there's less access for the patients to find someone who will help them. And I think all of the other guys mentioned everything.
Yep.
Oh, you're good.
Us two didn't really have a whole lot to add to the solution or the problem. Justice is difficult to obtain in this world of finite resources and talents, and I think we talked about everyone's offered ways of education, making more things available, and having the state help us. Equality won't happen, but we can come close to. I think we want to avoid mandates when you're trying to get justice, because that has unintended consequences.
Yep. You guys have been doing pretty good for a small table over there, coming up with some good ideas, so you're doing fine.
So I think overall, the conversation about justice is interesting when you work in a system where healthcare is not viewed as a right, but a commodity. So that's a whole nother conversation. But we focus more on provider bias and how do you address that? And I think you guys have already said most of it, but we were talking about standardization of the process within your clinic so that every provider is using the same structure. I think going back to Dr. Miller's talk in particular. And then even thinking about in our smaller town, there's just 2 clinics, so collaborating with the other clinics so that we have the same process and the same expectations so that hopefully patients view that as a more equitable system.
Awesome. Collaboration within your own town where you live in to come up with the same plans for a unified approach to patient care in your community, so nice.
We're going to repeat what others have said, but I guess just to put it in another way, similar to the table right here, is really working hard on an individual level to leave your prejudice and your beliefs at the door as you go in and see the patient. And then I guess there's a corollary we put in there, not one that we can control as much, but often hope that the patients will put their conceptions and beliefs in hold when they go in there too. Some people feel docs or other healthcare providers think a certain way, or they've jumped to that conclusion already too. So trying to keep both of us open-minded as we first meet and come to our goals.
If you remember my parachute law, if your mind's not open, a parachute's like a mind, if it's not open, it doesn't work.
So not surprisingly, we talked about access, and telehealth was discussed quite a bit. A couple of things that are important for everyone to know. Telehealth encounters from healthcare facility to healthcare facility are billable and reimbursable. So for example, if your patient is at your office and a specialist or counselor or any other discipline is at their office, that is something that is reimbursable and billable. So what I'd recommend is we have the technology in place. It's a matter of identifying the stakeholders who are willing to participate. And, you know, with my clinic, we've started doing telecounseling with a couple of outreach places, and it works very, very well. I think we need to continue to push at the state and the national level to improve reimbursement, specifically for mental and behavioral health counseling, where it should be able to be done at the patient's home just with a phone. Because currently the only thing that's reimbursable is audio and video from healthcare facility to healthcare facility with most insurances. There are some exceptions, but we have the technology. It's just a matter of getting together as a group of interested stakeholders and identifying participants who are willing to use that technology to help patients.
Awesome.
So the way, and I'm not an expert in it by any means, but for example, if one of our patients who lives in Polson goes into the Polson clinic, all they have to do is check them in, put them in a room, and they get, I think, $20 for their services. And then we bill for our encounter. No, not at all. It's just the facility, just the physical building and the equipment. And there's the app that our hospital uses is called Life Size, and my understanding is that it's free. So, you know, it's not easy to put together. Literally, it just takes a room and a computer with video and audio capability on both ends.
Yes, right here we have.
So I'm at a Billings clinic, which has telehealth. We do a lot of behavioral health, telehealth, but we use like Polson Clinic. I had patients there. I do inpatient now, so I don't do telehealth. That would be kind of difficult. Then sometimes you have to get credentialed at the other facility or wherever too.
Yep.
So it can be complex, but you know, we just really need to push for easier ways to get this done and what's acceptable. And I think we can get that, but we're going to have to make a legislative move for that.
Right. Any other tables that we forgot here? I think we got them all. I thank you guys for this exercise. I hope you guys kind of, this was, I wasn't expecting what to get out of this, so it's so really neat for me to see a lot of synergy, a lot of ideas that kind of were very similar and kind of overlapping, and kind of seeing where the challenges lie for us moving ahead. I would like to conclude this conference, if everyone feels good with that. If everyone, before I conclude though, I would like to thank the organizational staff who helped with this conference. We have Sarah Laney. Sarah, please stand up. Martha Robertson. Yep, I don't see her. Yep. And Robin Moki. Key individuals have been very helpful. Believe it or not, this is our first time putting this together. AHEC inherited this conference, so it's our first foray into this. So hopefully you guys got out of it what you're hoping to gain. I know for myself, and maybe it was a little too much coffee I had this morning, I feel energized by this a little bit. So I really feel energized that there's other kindred spirits out there in our state who feel very similar to myself. I feel a little uplifted in the mission that we're trying to accomplish. We will send out a list of attendees to everyone. We'll also send out a list of the speakers. Again, we'll also send out, I think, the entire video conference for this entire, am I correct with that, Sarah?
Yeah, we're going to get the link from MCAT. We're going to get the link from MCAT. So we'll get that sent out, and then we will also post it on the AHEC website.
And then we're going to query every individual one of our speakers, ask what PowerPoint slides are willing to share. We would like to have that for you now, but some of it may be copyrighted, and we don't want anyone getting into trouble, getting sued, and we don't want to do any copyright infringement. So with whatever slides they want to share, we'll get those out to you as well. And I would like to take 2 more shout outs, one to any council members that are left. I know Carrie Haney, she was helped plan this. To Carrie, stand up. Jen Robaum, and see her right there, she's trying to hide. I'd like to thank her. And Brandy Tyree was just here, I don't see her. But Brandy Tyree also did a great job as well with the council, so. Any other council members out there in the audience that I'm missing here at this point? And then I have one last shout out to Dr. Jennifer Schneider, who's sitting right up here very diligently. We're very happy that she came here and spent so much time yesterday. We pushed her pretty hard, so I think we need to get her some type of massage or some type of gift certificate for that. Again, I'd like to conclude this conference. We hope to do it again in 2 years. Any ideas that you have for future speakers, future ideas, please, would it be okay if they send it to you?
Yeah, you can send it directly to me. I'll be sending out the email with the rest of the handouts and everything, so feel free to respond to me and contact me for anything.
Yep, AHEC is dedicated to making this an every 2-year experience for Montana that we can come together and talk about the state of pain, see where we need to go. So thank you once again. I thank you for your time, your energy, and hopefully you've made some nice connections with other people and for the camaraderie of every one of you. So take care. Thanks.